Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. My name is Lillian, and I like making these videos just talking about the books that I've read. So today I'm very excited because this is a bit of a special video. I'm going to be covering 3 books, all by the same author. So the books are The Riot Act, Let's Give It Up for Gimme Lao, and the award goes to Sally Bong. And each of these books was written by Sebastian Sim. The first to come out was Let's Give It Up for Gimme Lao, and I think this is probably the best one. I can really tell that a lot of the charm and ideas that Sebastian has were really fleshed out for his debut English novel. Then the second book to come out was The Riot Act, which came out in 2018, and then the award goes to Sally Bong. It's kind of like a companion novel, almost a sequel to Let's Give It Up for Gimme Lao. This came out in 2021. All of these books did well in terms of the local fiction prize, the Epigram Fiction Prize. So the co-winner of the 2021 prize went to this book, and then actually the Riot Act won in 2017. So let's get into it. I actually picked up the Riot Act not knowing anything about it or Sebastian Sim, and I actually got very sucked into it because it's a blend of Singaporean local politics, current events, and kind of just capturing the pop culture zeitgeist as well as unique quirks to Singaporean culture. And yeah, just events, pop culture, and just what people are talking about, I feel like is what really sucked me in. So the premise of the Riot Act is we open up with the perspective of Harshwini, who is a young woman who thinks that she may have been the cause of the 2013 Little India riots. So the theme for this book is really around the role of migrant workers, the treatment of migrant workers, also a bit around how society views sexual abuse or like the role of women, and then also kind of looking at the politician's point of view. So we actually follow 3 women. The first is Harshwini. The second is a woman named Jessica, who has kind of been sucked into this role as a figurehead for sexual abuse survivors by accident. And then the third is a woman named Sharon, who's a very calculating politician who's trying to get ahead. So each of these female characters are kind of dealing with absurd situations. The second book that I read, since I actually ended up liking the Riot Act, I went on to read Sebastian's Let's Give It Up for Gimme Lao. And this, I think, is a good one to start with because I think this is the one that had the most positive reception, I feel like. And this follows the story of Gimme Lao, who is the main character, and we follow him from birth throughout his adult life, and he is very representative of the Singaporean who follows the tried and true path, who is very representative of like the circumstances and the common thinking or like the common sense thinking that was prevalent during that time. And you really follow him throughout a few different formative events. And the themes of this book are really around how like the backstory of our current PAP politicians or the male leaders that we have in Singapore. And this is also very cheeky, and you have a lot of like fun backstories and anecdotes, but also some very messed up things that happen. We follow Gimme Lao as he has like these formative childhood experiences, but then is quite driven in school, in finding his partner. He then goes on to work at Tan Tock Seng Hospital, and he becomes the head of the communicable disease division. And throughout, there are various characters that kind of illuminate the role of activists or the lives of LGBTQ folk in Singapore. And so you definitely have some hidden political commentary or social commentary, rather, just by seeing through the lens of this very basic kind of run-of-the-mill, like very risk-averse, pragmatic. That's a very like Singaporean trait stereotypically, is to not rock the boat and take the most steady path forward. And so that's kind of the main focus when we follow the life of Gimme Lao. And then finally, I think because that book did so well and everyone really liked it, this novel, and the award goes to Sally Bong, is kind of like a sequel. There are overlapping characters in all three books, but I think this one has more of a similar subject matter to Gimme Lao. And I think these two are kind of more companions. Like they both kind of focus on civic duty, and both of these main characters are part of the system and have their own kind of goals and objectives. The difference is the Gimme Lao is kind of almost accidentally becomes very ambitious and someone who prioritizes his success over everything else, whereas Sally Bong, she is someone who is a do-gooder. And she is someone who believes in fairness and equality and justice to the point of being very naive. And so the whole thread through this novel is kind of her realization that things aren't actually as fair as she would hope, and that she's basically going through this realization throughout her whole life that there are very unfair aspects to Singapore's society and to life in general, and grapples with how her very good faith efforts to change that might sometimes be insensitive or cause harm because she comes from such a place of naivete. So similar to Let's Give It Up for Gimme Lao, this novel, which is And the Award Goes to Sally Bong, follows her from her childhood until adulthood, and we follow her career. She becomes a nurse, also at Tan Tock Seng Hospital, and various incidents that she goes through. For example, realizing that one of her childhood friends is now in jail leads her to become very involved with the Yellow Ribbon Project, which is a real prisoner rehabilitation program in Singapore. She also becomes involved in local politics and cross paths with Gimme Lao. And there's also several key storylines around LGBTQ folk in Singapore and how they're treated differently, and kind of Sally's realization or having her eyes uncovered as to how folks who kind of live on the margin, who don't fit into that very basic archetype, live and the challenges that they face. Okay, so that was kind of a wild dash of plot summary of each of the books, but I think what's maybe more helpful is for me to describe the overall tone and kind of the project of what I think Sebastian Sim is trying to do, and just kind of how he writes. So I think one thing to be aware of is it's definitely kind of a satirical / stereotypical style. I found it super engaging, and I was surprised like how much of a page turner each of these books are, and I actually found them really easy to read, super compelling, and well written. I think Sebastian Sim has a very adept control of his voice, and he's really able to describe things with certainty and in a way that's very vivid and speaks to reality. Like, he definitely, his superpower is incorporating the absurdities and sillinesses of everyday life and then putting them on the page through these characters. It might not be everyone's cup of tea because it is sometimes a little bit too silly, especially the Riot Act. The things that happen are just kind of absurd, but it's by design. I don't think it's a flaw. And the way I would think about it is these are just like Crazy Rich Asians, but actually with interesting and salient and more substantive topics. So it's more that style of writing where it's a little bit absurdist, it's a little bit satirical, it's definitely very funny, and the characters that he is presenting to you, they are caricatures, and it is a stereotype, and they may seem a bit too simple or one-dimensional to some readers, but to me, I feel like he did a great job of giving nuance to Singapore society and showing a lot of different ways of life and a lot of different characters. Especially, I think he does a great job of really putting that politician slash I'm a good Singaporean kind of archetype under the microscope, and to really peel back the layers to that, and how do folks end up having such positive views of themselves and thinking that they're doing such a great job, or how greedy they are as politicians. I think like each of these different characters that come up in these books in one way could be a stereotype or a caricature, but in another way like really embody the traits of a lot of that type of person in Singapore. So I think it's like a feature of his writing, not really a bug. And I really enjoyed it. Like, you take it with a grain of salt. Like, obviously, these are not meant to be like super deep, biting, well-researched depictions of social issues in Singapore. But honestly, I feel like this is a more effective way to bring to light a variety of things, because it does go down really easy. It's really fun to read, and it's really topical and really current. Like, I'm not Singaporean, so a few things kind of went over my head, but most of it was just really drawn from either people I know, things I've seen in the news, or just types of people that you see around in Singapore. And so I think he did a really great job at that. And I also feel like the characters he introduced so that he could talk about issues like migrant worker rights or various ways that activism does appear and happen in Singapore, and also especially like the lives of LGBTQ people and the issues that they face. I thought it was done like pretty seamlessly. And well, I think even just the inclusion of it is something that distinguishes this series from other books. A lot of the Singlit I've written does include these heavy topics or have some type of social point of view, but everything I've read so far has done it in like a very serious way. And something about having it being treated as something that's just part of his overall skewering of Singaporean society almost feels like more inclusive. Rather than making the whole book about that as some deep metaphor, he's just kind of making fun of all of Singapore and all of the different types of people in Singaporean society. But in that, it's also how folks who are living on the margins, or who have they have an alternative lifestyle or a non-traditional lifestyle, how they're affected, or how these absurd situations arise because of their place in society. I just feel like it's a lot more engaging and inclusive. I can see like a counterpoint where it may feel a bit too much. And I could see like some people even being offended at how flippantly some of these characters who are meant to represent a certain activist group are treated. But for me, it's totally fine. I feel like it's part of the genre. It's part of the charm of the books. And I'd rather have that in than have like no mention of it at all, because you're afraid that you're not treating it in like the most serious, well-researched, most politically correct vein. I feel like what's so refreshing and entertaining about these books is that Sebastian Sim has really captured what it feels like to like grow up in the system and to live in this culture and to live in this world. Insofar as I can tell, like, I would love to hear from Singaporeans, because I'm not Singaporean. And I do think that like it's possible for these novels to be more entertaining because I'm not from the country. You know, like sometimes when you read satire that hits too close to home, you just feel like it can't really be done well because your experience is not always going to be the same as everyone else's experience. But as an outsider, as someone who's not Singaporean, I just feel like these books do so much a better job at depicting Singapore than like Crazy Rich Asians or any of the other like more romance-driven novels that take place in Singapore. I think it's probably just Crazy Rich Asians. I don't really know that there have been others, but I really recommend this if you want like a light, entertaining read. And I feel like a lot of times light and entertaining is conflated with not good writing or not good plotting, but this is well done. Like, the characterizations are really clever and funny. The plotting is great. Like the way that Sim builds suspense and like little funny things that happen or paints out absurd situations, I think are really well done and creative. So just because it's easy to read doesn't mean it's like less valuable or less uh, laudable than other literature, which you can tell because these books did win a lot of local awards. And I just feel like that writing style was really engaging, but not vapid. Like, how great is it to use this light, entertaining style and this kind of satirical, caricature driven content to actually talk about social issues and not talk about, like, you know, family squabbles or like rom-com chick lit type of stuff. Like that's still in here. There are petty squabbles. It definitely shows like the interrelationships between all the different characters, but I think the inclusion of just things that have happened in Singapore's history. So for example, in the word goes to Sally Bong, like her parents are Chinese educated and actually not huge fans of the PAP, which came from obviously Lee Kuan Yew, who was British educated, and there was that early divide, and there's discussion among her parents and Sally about what happened in the early 60s when they rounded up the so-called communists. And another example is obviously the riots that happened in Little India, or even just describing like hyper local events. For example, he depicts like a play, an experimental play that's put on by the Substation, which was a real experimental theater in Singapore, and the activism. There's an activist who cares about migrant worker rights. Her name's Omala, and she's very, like, her whole organization is very similar to TWC2, which is a real migrant worker advocacy organization in Singapore. Just his inclusion of all of these very realistic pockets of activism or just situations that actually have happened, or conversations just like deep, like not even so deep, but just like real conversations that happen that just add so much color and flavor and texture to Singapore, you know, beyond just like Gardens by the Bay or like the way it's viewed from an expat or traditionally like a tourist point of view. Like these novels really capture like the zeitgeist of Singapore and like the various like caricatures and conversations that would be happening. So definitely, if I'm thinking about books to recommend to people that are easy to digest, also have like really fun, like rollicking plot lines, but also can teach you a little bit about what it's like to live in Singapore, I would definitely recommend these novels. Yeah, so I think for ratings, I think I'll just rank them in the order of my favorite to least favorite. I think my favorite is Let's Give It Up for Gimme Lao, because I just feel like this was the OG. It's so punchy. Like the things that happen are so absurd, but then you also believe that they could happen. And I think the character of Gimme Lao is like very fascinating because he just is really stand-in for like the average Singaporean politician, and just peeling that back and like understanding where that comes from and like the formative events in his life, I think is really clever. And I don't know of any other books that do it in this tone and this style. So this would be my favorite. Then I really like the Riot Act. It's a little bit more absurd. Like the things that happen are kind of silly. And a lot of the stuff that happens is very like social media driven. And I feel like this one is a little bit more sensationalist. But I don't mind. I thought the depiction of the 3 different female characters was really interesting and kind of like just a cool juxtaposition of, you know, 3 different points of view and 3 very different lives. And I found this to have like an engaging storyline. The ending, I don't know if the ending was as satisfying, but I liked following each of the characters and kind of their issues and what they were chasing after. And then third, I would say in the word goes to Sally Bong. I mean, this one is where it does kind of feel like he's really trying to cram in a lot of every single type of activist in Singapore and every type of like situation that Sally comes up against. It's like, oh, she had no idea that gay people exist, or like, oh, she had no idea that actually like it's hard to find a job after you leave prison. It's a little bit like heavy handed, but I still really enjoyed it. We have some of the same characters, which was fun to see. And I think Sally definitely exists. This is like the well intentioned auntie who thinks that by doing ABC, she's really like fixing the system and contributing. And she is, but it's just kind of like naive because she's not really examining why there's injustice to begin with or how the system is inequitable from its root. So I think that it's definitely very worthwhile to have that kind of character, but maybe just like less interesting than the characters in the first two. So probably let's give it up for Gimme Lao. I would give 4 stars. The Riot Act and Sally Bong maybe 3.5 stars. But I would just pick one of these and see if you like the style. It's very entertaining and funny. And I feel like as long as you don't get too annoyed by like how much he packs in current events and like things that happen, which I actually really like, then these will definitely be fun books for you to try out.